icy silence of Maplewood, the first victim, Daniel Mercer, was found with a coin by his side. Years later, Rebecca Clarke in British Columbia, Ethan Miller in Alberta, and George Sullivan in Saskatchewan each turned up in the same chilling display. Their lives ended with ritual precision. Newspapers called the faceless predator the ghost killer, a phantom leaving no trace but tokens of dread. The nation lived in fear until a grainy camera revealed Charles Harlow, a quiet repairman hiding in plain sight. This is the dark truth behind Canada's most feared serial killer, an ordinary man with extraordinary evil. Winter morning was quiet, the kind of stillness that only comes when the air is heavy with frost. The town of Maplewood, tucked away in the Ontario countryside, was used to silence at this time of year. Snow covered the rooftops, the streets were nearly empty, and even the river had frozen solid, becoming part of the landscape. It was along this riverbank that a jogger made a discovery that would haunt the town for decades. At first, he thought he had stumbled upon a mannequin, the kind children sometimes throw away after Halloween. But as he stepped closer, the horrifying truth revealed itself. A body lay partly buried in snow, the skin pale and stiff, the eyes frozen open as if locked in a final stare. The police arrived quickly, their boots crunching against the icy ground. The initial assumption was straightforward. Perhaps the victim had slipped, fallen into the river, and been carried by the current before freezing into place. Accidents like this had happened before during brutal Canadian winters. Yet within minutes, doubt began to cloud the simple explanation. The victim, a man in his early 30s, had marks on his wrists, thin red lines that looked too precise to be caused by ice or rope caught in the current. On his arm was a small bruise, round and deep, as if pressed by a deliberate hand. What unsettled the investigators most was the way the body had been arranged. His arms were crossed tightly over his chest, his legs aligned neatly, and at his side was a small coin, gleaming against the snow. It wasn't the kind of thing nature could create, nor something a random accident would produce. The placement was purposeful, deliberate, almost ceremonial. One of the officers quietly noted this in his report, but didn't speak about it publicly. The town was not ready to hear whispers of ritual or design. The coroner's findings only deepened the mystery. The man had not drowned. He had not died from exposure to the cold. Instead, his cause of death was suffocation, with bruising on, the neck consistent with strong hands tightening until the life drained away. The timeline suggested he was killed elsewhere and later positioned near the riverbank. Whoever had done this wanted the body to be found, and wanted it discovered in a way that suggested more than just violence. It suggested control. Despite these troubling signs, the case went cold almost immediately. The victim was identified as a traveler passing through Maplewood, someone with no strong connections to the community. The police labeled it an isolated crime, most likely an act of robbery gone wrong. Without leads, without suspects, and without further incidents, the investigation lost momentum. But for those who had seen the body firsthand, the image never left their minds. The coin in particular became a silent symbol of dread. Why had it been placed there? What message had the killer meant to send? In the months that followed, life in Maplewood slowly returned to normal. The frozen river melted, children played in the streets again, and neighbors chatted outside grocery stores as if nothing had happened. But beneath the calm surface of everyday life, unease lingered. The crime was never solved, and although people wanted to believe it was a random act of violence, the truth was far more unsettling. For in the silence of that winter, the first victim of Canada's most feared serial killer had been discovered, and the shadow of something far darker was about to spread. Over the next few years, the strange death near the frozen river faded from public memory, but the same could not be said for the investigators who had studied the scene. They kept the case file tucked away, pulling it out occasionally when another unexplained death surfaced elsewhere in Canada. What began to emerge was not a single tragedy, but a chilling pattern that stretched far beyond the boundaries of one small Ontario town. In 2001, a woman was found in a quiet corner of British Columbia, lying face up in a wooded clearing. Like the man in Maplewood, her body showed no obvious signs of robbery or sexual assault. Instead, it appeared as if she had been carefully, positioned, her arms folded gently at her sides, a small feather resting on her chest. Locals believed she had been the victim of a random attack, perhaps someone passing through. But detectives who compared the photos to the Maplewood file noticed disturbing similarities. Both bodies bore faint bruising on the wrists. Both displayed marks on the neck, and both were accompanied by a seemingly meaningless object. The following year, a teenager in Alberta disappeared on his way home from school. When his body was discovered near an abandoned barn, the details were almost identical. Neatly placed, hands arranged, a piece of string curled beside him as though dropped intentionally. By now, 3 provinces had witnessed deaths that carried an eerie consistency. Still, the authorities struggled to connect them. The victims were different in every possible way: a young boy, an adult woman, and a male traveler with no fixed address. There was no shared age, no shared lifestyle, no single place that tied them together. To most investigators, these were coincidences. To a few, they were evidence of something far more terrifying. Whispers began within law enforcement circles. Someone meticulous was choosing people without a clear motive, killing them quietly, then leaving behind small tokens like a signature. The randomness of the victims wasn't a flaw in the investigation. It was part of the design. Whoever was behind these murders seemed determined to avoid detection by refusing to follow any predictable pattern. It was a game, and the killer was winning. By 2004, the media began to notice the similarities. A handful of journalists pieced together the stories, suggesting that Canada was facing a new kind of predator, one who traveled across the country, striking without warning. They speculated about the meaning of the objects left behind. Were they clues, trophies, messages? Each theory was more chilling than the last, but no one could prove anything. Police officials downplayed the connection, unwilling to fuel panic without solid evidence. Yet beneath the surface, fear spread quickly. Parents kept their children indoors. Travelers thought twice before taking long, lonely roads. The image of neatly placed bodies haunted every town where one was found, and though the cases were officially unsolved, a growing number of people began to suspect that a single figure was behind it all. The stage was being set for one of the darkest chapters in Canadian criminal history, and the pattern was only beginning to reveal its true scale. By the mid-2000s, fear had seeped into communities across Canada, though many people couldn't quite explain why. Newspapers covered the deaths in scattered articles, often buried deep inside their pages, but a nickname soon began to circulate that would cement itself in the country's collective memory: the Ghost Killer. The title was born from frustration as much as from fear. Every time authorities thought they had a lead, it dissolved into nothing. Every piece of evidence seemed to vanish, as if the killer himself had slipped through walls and disappeared into thin air. For investigators, the sense of invisibility was maddening. There were no fingerprints on the bodies, no DNA on the strange tokens left behind, and no witnesses who ever claimed to see anything suspicious. Crime scenes were spotless, cold, and deliberate. It was as though the murderer was watching the investigators, studying their every move and ensuring no mistakes were made. In some cases, the killer seemed to anticipate police theories. When newspapers reported on the coins left at one scene, the next victim bore a different object, as if the killer was mocking the very people trying to catch him. The public responded with paranoia. The idea that someone so calculating could move unnoticed across provinces was more terrifying than the crimes themselves. No one felt safe. People avoided walking home alone. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion, and rural towns began to lock their doors in ways they hadn't in decades. It wasn't just the killings, it was the silence that followed each one. Days would turn into weeks, weeks into months, and just when the fear began to fade, another body would appear hundreds of miles away. The killer's unpredictability became his most powerful weapon. The randomness of his victims fed the legend of the ghost killer. Unlike other murderers who targeted specific groups, sex workers, the homeless, or young women, this predator chose without discrimination. An elderly farmer in Saskatchewan, a college student in Montreal, a truck driver in Manitoba, each one different, each one ending up in the same ritualistic display, The objects left behind became his twisted calling cards, but their meanings remained frustratingly unclear. Investigators tried to build psychological profiles, guessing at symbolism: coins for time, feathers for freedom, strings for control. None of it led to answers. What terrified the nation most was the growing realization that he could be anyone. He blended so well into ordinary life that even seasoned detectives began to suspect the killer might have ties to law enforcement, or perhaps medical training, or even military experience. He knew too much, stayed too careful, and left behind nothing that could tie him to the crimes. The possibility that he was walking among the very people hunting him sent waves of unease through every level of society. By 2008, the ghost killer was no longer just a shadow in police files. He had become a story parents whispered to children as warnings, a presence that hung over highways, bus stations, and empty rural roads. He wasn't just a murderer, he was an idea, a phantom who seemed untouchable, and his legend was still being written in blood. The more the media spoke his name, the more it seemed he responded, determined to remind Canada that he was always there, always watching, and always ready to strike again. Winter of 2011, more than a decade after the first body was discovered in Maplewood, the ghost killer finally stumbled. It was a mistake so small, so ordinary, that at first it seemed impossible it could bring down someone who had eluded capture for so long. Yet for investigators who had grown accustomed to chasing shadows, this mistake was the first real thread they could grasp. It began with a gas station camera in a small town in Manitoba. The grainy footage showed a man purchasing fuel just after midnight. He wore a heavy winter coat and a dark cap pulled low to hide his face, but something about the way he moved caught attention. He walked with a noticeable limp, dragging his right leg slightly as though from an old injury. A few hours later, a body was found in an abandoned lot only 3 kilometers from that same gas station, positioned neatly as always. The victim bore the same ritualistic marks and had, beside her body, a single feather that seemed to have been placed with deliberate care. At first, investigators treated the camera footage as yet another frustrating dead end. The man's face was never visible, and hundreds of people had stopped at that station over the years. But when the limp was mentioned on the evening news, someone came forward, a retired factory worker who recognized the peculiar gait. He claimed it belonged to a man named Charles Harlow, a local repairman who lived on the edge of town. Harlow was quiet, polite, and forgettable, the kind of neighbor who nodded hello but never lingered in conversation. He drove an old van, worked odd jobs, and had lived in the area for years without incident. On the surface, he was the picture of an ordinary man. Detectives began surveillance quietly, watching Harlow's movements for weeks. He never drew attention to himself. He went to work, bought groceries, and walked home the same way every day. But when police obtained a warrant to search his property, the quiet exterior shattered. Inside his cluttered home were boxes stacked against the walls, each filled with carefully labeled newspaper clippings, photographs, and maps. Tucked inside envelopes were small objects that matched the signatures found beside the victims: coins, strings, and feathers, each catalogued with disturbing precision. Even more chilling were the notebooks. Page after page contained details about strangers, their schedules, the routes they took to work, the times they were alone. Harlow had stalked dozens of people, though not all had become victims. The planning was meticulous, sometimes lasting weeks or even months before he acted. His trophies, his writings, his organization, it was the exact opposite of chaos. It was control, and it painted the portrait of a man who had been hiding in plain sight all along. News of Harlow's arrest spread like wildfire. For years, Canadians had lived under the shadow of the ghost killer, a faceless predator who seemed untouchable. Now the mask was gone. The quiet repairman, the man who walked with a limp and lived unnoticed among his neighbors, was the monster they had feared for over a decade. Yet even as the evidence stacked against him, there were unanswered questions. Had he truly acted alone? Were there victims who had never been discovered? The arrest brought relief, but also unease. If this was the end, why did it feel like the story was only just beginning? The trial of Charles Harlow became one of the most closely watched court cases in Canadian history. For years, the name Ghost Killer had haunted newspapers and television reports, and now the man behind the shadow was finally standing before a judge. The courtroom was crowded each day, filled with grieving families, reporters, and curious citizens who wanted to see the face of the monster who had terrified a nation. What they saw was not a towering figure of menace, but a thin, aging man with tired eyes and a quiet demeanor. His ordinariness unsettled people more than any monstrous image could have. The killer they had imagined for years looked no different than the man who might fix their roof or deliver their mail. As evidence unfolded, the details grew darker with every witness. Investigators revealed the contents of Harlow's home, the clippings, the tokens, the maps. Each item connected him to a victim, but the tokens carried a deeper meaning that prosecutors argued showed his twisted philosophy. The coins represented time running out, the feathers represented freedom taken away, and the string symbolized life cut short. Each placement was intentional, a ritual meant to transform his crimes into something he believed was larger than life. Psychologists who interviewed Harlow painted a chilling portrait. He showed no signs of remorse, no guilt, and no clear motive in the traditional sense. He had not killed for money, revenge, or even out of anger. Instead, he described his actions as part of a design, a role he believed he was chosen to fulfill. To him, his victims were not people but pieces of a pattern that only he understood. He spoke about fate, destiny, and control in ways that disturbed even the most seasoned professionals. It was not madness in the chaotic sense. It was cold, detached logic warped into something monstrous. The trial revealed that Harlow had likely stalked many more people than he ever killed. Journals recovered from his home described dozens of individuals whose routines he had studied, but never targeted. Some were spared because their schedules changed unexpectedly, others because they moved away or became too public to approach. This randomness only deepened the horror for families of the victims. It meant that survival was not based on strength, awareness, or choice. It was luck, nothing more. Anyone could have been selected. When the guilty verdict was read, the courtroom sat in heavy silence. Relief washed over some families, but it was mixed with the bitter knowledge that no sentence could erase the years of fear or bring back those who had been lost. Harlow was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole, but for many the punishment felt inadequate compared to the scale of the terror he had inflicted. Even after the conviction, questions lingered. Investigators quietly admitted that not all the cases attributed to the ghost killer could be definitively linked to Harlow. Some bodies had been found in regions where his presence could not be proven. Others bore similarities but lacked the distinctive tokens. Was it possible that Harlow had inspired someone else or even worked with an accomplice? The uncertainty fed the legend, leaving open the possibility that the ghost killer's story was not fully over. In the end, the darkest truth was not simply that Harlow had killed. It was that he had lived among ordinary people for more than a decade, unnoticed, unsuspected, blending seamlessly into everyday life. He was proof that evil could wear the face of normalcy, that the most terrifying monsters are not the ones hiding in the shadows, but the ones standing quietly beside us. Even behind prison walls, the legacy of the ghost killer endured, leaving Canadians to wonder how many more secrets still lay buried in the snow.